up, everyone? Welcome to another exciting episode of Retro Encounter. Unlike our normal episodes, this is going to be a bonus round episode where we kind of get a little off track from old games. We talk about something fun.
Like different old games.
Or an old system.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So today we're here to talk about the Super Nintendo. But before we do that, I want to introduce everybody that's here. As always, I am Josh Curry. With me is Davi Tesnovich.
Feeling limber.
And Mike Sollosi.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, this is Mike Sollosi. I'm Monsoon on the RPG Fan boards, and I love the Super Nintendo, and I'm excited to talk about it.
You sound enthusiastic.
I am enthusiastic, Josh. I mean, it's probably my favorite system for RPGs ever. And it was the system I first played RPGs on. It has a ton of awesome games. I love the Super Nintendo, no two ways about it.
It's one of those things that just because of a lot of people, at least a lot of people that I talk to, their age, it was a very pivotal system for it. It was either the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis, and that's kind of like what a lot of people grew up with in that age. I think you have a very different perspective on gaming depending on which one you had, but everybody kind of has a soft spot in their heart for one of the two.
Yeah, and for me, it's the Super Nintendo and not the Genesis. I was not really into Sega stuff at all until I bought a Dreamcast in like the early 2000s for $20 and became a Dreamcast hipster for a few years. But I mean, the Super Nintendo was not my first system. I had an NES before Super Nintendo, but it was the first system I played a lot of RPGs on, and my first RPG was Final Fantasy IV, even though I thought it was FF2 at the time. And it really sort of created the monster, like me just going crazy and trying to find all of the great Japanese RPGs for the system.
What about you, Davey? What's your history with the Super Nintendo?
I also grew up with the Super Nintendo. Like I was constantly renting games and just playing through everything I could find. Like I'd be searching for RPGs. But I also grew up with the NES, and I eventually did get a Genesis, but that like kind of just turned into a Shining Force machine. But the Super Nintendo just like had so much gold on it, like so much content for me, and yeah, it really shaped who I was as a gamer.
So the Super Nintendo.
One other thing I want to add, and I suspect, Davey, you maybe are in a similar boat than I am. In the early 2000s, I sort of, in my young internet days, I learned that there were a bunch of awesome Super Nintendo, or more accurately, Super Famicom games that the United States never got. So I discovered emulation for the first time, trying to play those missing Super Nintendo RPGs. Like Seiken Densetsu 3, which I was sold as Secret of Mana 2, and a bunch of missing Super Nintendo games, and I went a little nuts emulating Super Nintendo stuff in the early 2000s, and it made me only like the system more.
Well, it was stuff that we never had access to otherwise. Like if we were kids growing up in Japan, like we could have scrounged up money and like gotten these games eventually. But like just the idea of these games just like after the fact surfacing and just like that was only like a couple years after the Super Nintendo was still vital, It's like stuff like the Star Ocean translation, Bahamut Lagoon, Tales of Fantasia. Like most of those games, like, well, actually not most of those games. Most of those games ended up coming out later, like especially on the PSP for some reason, and lots of enhanced versions would come out with really, really late translations. And those were great versions of those games, but like when you're growing up at that time, when you ran across a fan translator, it was like this magical, wonderful thing. Like it was like finding a whole new world that never existed before.
Yeah, exactly. And it's probably worth mentioning. Like RPGs were considered niche or uncommon as Americans playing video games in the 90s, where like they were very popular, but the ones that were popular were mostly like the big Square titles, right? And but it's worth mentioning that in Japan, RPGs are the biggest, most popular genre, and there are like dozens, if not hundreds, of bad Super Nintendo RPGs or Super Famicom RPGs that people probably rightfully thought wouldn't be worth sending to the United States. So I mean, and there was a lot of, and I mean, when I was emulating stuff in the in starting in the early 2000s, it was a mind blow that there were 3 Super Nintendo Fire Emblem games, 2 Super Nintendo Dragon Quest Dragon Warrior games. Uh, another Mana game that when Secret of Mana was one of my all-time favorites. There was a wealth of, it was like, discovering the console all over again when just seeking out fan translations of old Super Nintendo RPGs.
Well, a lot of that stuff, like a lot of them were pretty bad, like, and that's why they didn't make it across. Like, they didn't sell well in the first place, or they were just clearly bad critically. But a lot of them were just swan songs that didn't make sense to translate so late into the console's life cycle. Like the ones I mentioned before, like Bahamut Lagoon and Star Ocean came out really late into Super Nintendo's life cycle. So, like, you still see that happen today when something is announced late in a console's life in Japan. Like, I always still get worried. Like, I guess it's just part of my DNA now.
Yeah, there was one. It's not an RPG, obviously, but there was one Mega Man game, Rockman and Forte or Mega Man and Bass, that came out, I think, in like '97 or '98, like super late for a Super Nintendo game. But I don't think the United States got the SNES version, but we did get it on GBA a few years later, and it's a pretty alright Mega Man game too.
Yeah, it is.
So you'll
Did you,
hear that I'm kind of like oddly quiet. So I had a Super Nintendo. I had the best game in the history of video games on that Super Nintendo, which was Mario All Stars. That included Super Mario World on it.
That's a hell of a package.
Yeah, I will not even, like, we can't even have an argument. Like, that is the best game of all. First of all, Super Mario World by itself is probably the best game of all time. But then you put it in the same package of all the other Marios, and it's like, yep, no questions asked. Boom, done.
Yeah.
But I still don't really understand how any of this happened. I was probably like, I don't know, 3 or something, I don't know. And like Genesis was doing all of its like ads with like all that attitude and this coolness, and look at Sonic, he runs so fast. And I don't remember any of the build up, but at some point like my Nintendo just disappeared, and for Christmas I got a Genesis with Sonic 1 and 2. And so maybe I guess maybe that explains why everybody's like, "Oh, you hate Nintendo." I don't, but I didn't. So like I missed out on a lot of that. Like I didn't have the Super Nintendo, and then because of that, like I didn't ever saw like the value in 64. So I like skipped everything until the portable devices of like Nintendo Advance and like Game Boy Color, I guess too. But I was on the Genesis side, so I missed almost the entirety of the Super Nintendo. Like I didn't have any of these tentpole RPGs. I didn't play I didn't play Zelda back in the day. And it wasn't until they started re-releasing the classics on DS that it's like, oh, these games are fantastic. That's when I first experienced Chrono Trigger. That's when I experienced Final Fantasy IV. And I was like, these games are unbelievable. Like these came out years and years ago, and they're probably this year were actually being like one of the best games of the year, and it's a re-release. But yeah, like I don't have that same kind of like nostalgia for Super Nintendo because that wasn't part of my childhood. I know everybody like then wants to make the jokes like, oh, you got Genesis, oh, that's so terrible. And I was like, I was really happy with my Genesis, but that's I guess a different podcast.
Literally, probably, yeah.
And now Sega and Nintendo are such good friends that I can get a lot of the Sega games I missed over the years on the different virtual consoles.
Yeah, it was so weird.
Yeah, I haven't played them yet, but I have. I think I have Wii Virtual Console copies of Phantasy Star 3 and 4 and Gunstar Heroes and a couple others that I will get to eventually, maybe.
Yeah, and I'll readily admit, like, and we've talked about this, I believe, on the podcast before. I wasn't big into RPGs back then, or even like when I was, I didn't realize that they were RPGs. Like I I played all of the Mario RPGs that were like on DS and whatnot and Game Boy Advance, and I was like, I didn't realize that like those were RPGs. Like I'm playing a Mario game or like Pokemon. I'm going out and catching critters. Like that's like snuck in the RPG and tricked me, you know. Um,
Yeah.
but I back then I was like I was playing all like I played a lot of sports games, and for like the Genesis I was like super happy, and I loved Sonic, but I always really missed Mario, and that was always what was sad for me is I didn't have Mario, and that it wasn't until like the DS that came out I was like wow I missed a generation of games that I would have really enjoyed, and then I'm in that like classic adult thing where it's like hey I have money like I'm gonna like go buy a Super Nintendo or I'm gonna like track down all these games and hey eBay like isn't that great? And now I'm spending like hordes of money that I probably shouldn't on stuff that I know people just tell me to like pirate, but it just seems like not genuine about it, I guess.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so that and everybody's like, hey, Josh isn't being like his loudmouth usual self. It's because I just don't have a lot of those nostalgic experiences with the system.
Well, I will say it's been really nice seeing, like you mentioned, the resurgence of these games in the form of like digital services and stuff. Like Mike was talking about Fantasy Star, and like when he was talking about Sega Collection, I assumed that it was going to be a Shining Force one, but Fantasy Star, man, those cartridges are so rare. Like it's so nice to see that stuff come back and people to have a legit way to get a hold of this and like see some of the DNA and like see which ones hold up, which Fantasy Star 4 definitely does. Um, but I don't know. It's nice to see like modern and young people see these games and like I said, the DNA of the genre and like I don't know the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches.
Yeah, yeah, and they're specifically the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. They were so entirely different. Like I think younger people for sure that are, like grow up with like the PS4 and the Xbox One, like they
Yeah.
will not understand. They will not be able to understand that because you look at it, it's like, well, all the games came out everywhere. Like it's the same. Like, hey, I get my Halo here and I get my Uncharted here, but for the most part, we get all the same stuff. Like maybe I have to wait a year to get Tomb Raider, but I eventually get it. Or hey, that Minecraft, that's everywhere. Um,
Yeah, like if you look at the Xbox One controller and the PS4 controller, there's differences, but they have, a lot of the same functionality. One D-pad, two sticks, four face buttons, like several triggers on the shoulders. Like it's basically the same, and games are designed to be played on both systems. But the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis had hugely different controllers. Like and like the Super Nintendo's four face buttons are basically the standard now, but there was so many differences between those two systems that even different versions of the same game would be hugely different. Like playing Street Fighter 2 on the Genesis, you had to press start to switch the A, B, and C buttons from punches to kicks.
oh, it was an absolute disaster.
And it was
It made it so it was basically unplayable. Like you couldn't even begin to consider playing that. But then you look at, if I remember correctly, Genesis had blood for Mortal Kombat, and Super Nintendo did not.
Yep, and the Genesis version of Aladdin was way better. There's
so
a bunch.
good.
Yeah, there's a bunch of specific examples, but we should maybe start talking about the Super Nintendo again because it's ostensibly the theme of this episode.
You don't want to talk about Genesis with me?
I just need to say, every time someone brings up Street Fighter 2 on the Genesis, they neglect to mention that there were 6-button pads.
Yes.
You just had to go get a 6-button pad, dude. And then it was awesome.
It was fantastic then. But for the
Yeah, if you had a Saturn style pad, then it was good, and you could actually buy Saturn style pads to play Street Fighter 4 on the PS3 or 360. Mad Catz made a couple of those, and they were great.
it's because Mad
But-
Catz makes everything.
Yeah.
Well,
Crap out everything. But yeah, let's talk. So we kind of went over our histories. Let's talk about some of our favorites. And we kind of touched a little bit on it, but let's talk about like one or two like really standout games for you from that generation. We'll start with you, Davey, or Mike, I guess. Sure.
No, Davey can go ahead.
sure. It's really hard to narrow it down like that. There's a lot of games I love for the Super Nintendo. I guess I'll take the hit and say the one that everyone's thinking, and the Chrono Trigger. Like that game, it's amazing how well that game still holds up. Like just the pacing of it, the like when um when my wife first played Chrono Trigger, I told her like it's an RPG, but it weirdly feels really fast and arcadey. And like it was the first time I thought about the game that way, and it kind of like I had a paradigm shift when I looked back at Chrono Trigger. Like I don't remember Chrono Trigger in menus the way that I remember so many other SNES RPGs. Like they had a really light touch with the UI and like just the small horizontal bars that signified combat and like everything being in the same animation style and like what we would today call the same engine. Like
Yeah, well, yeah. There's no cutaways for battles.
yeah, it's seamless, and like people still struggle with that in RPGs today. Like look at Tales of Zestiria, like that tried to have seamless battle transitions, which were already less seamless than Chrono Trigger, and they totally wrecked the battle camera. And it's like people are still struggling trying to get this flow of like perspective and changing from field movement to battle. Like it's amazing that it was so perfect, and like that game just feels like a steady stream of just game like all the way through, and RPGs almost never feel like that, and I feel like that's why that game touches so many people that aren't even fans of the genre.
Fans of the genre love this game.
Yeah, I love Chrono Trigger too. It has really appealing characters. The story is not hugely long. I think even if it's your first time playing, you'll probably beat it in 20 or 25 hours,
Yeah,
which
is right.
which is less than, a lot of meaty RPGs of the era. But like the story just continually raises its stakes at a nice pace, and before you know it, you're fighting the Lavos core, and it's awesome. But and also it's sort of interesting. I don't know if we'll ever get a Chrono Trigger game ever again, because it was literally the RPG titans of that day uniting for a dream project, because it was it's the writer and artist from Dragon Quest with like Square's team of all-stars, including the creator of the Final Fantasy series, and it's awesome. Like Chrono Trigger is beloved all over the world, even though Europe didn't get it until the PS1 version several years later. And yeah, everyone likes Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger rocks.
Also, not as popular, but pretty good. Lufia 2. I know we talked a little bit about Lufia 2, Mike. Like, just the integration of the dungeon puzzle solving and the RPG battle system. Like, it was a really good chocolate and peanut butter scenario at that point in time. Like, took two extremely popular genres that the Venn diagram of which was almost totally overlapping, like between like a Zelda game and a turn-based RPG at that time. And it just like, I don't know, having something to do between those random battles, and like the fact that battles weren't even random was a different thing. But they weren't, were they, Mike?
No, the enemies appeared on screen,
and you could affect them with your sub weapons like wild arms, right?
Yes, and also whenever you moved, they moved. So you could strategically plan out avoiding monsters or having them chase you or having them ignore you. And so not only are the RPG mechanics rock solid, the puzzles are really good and really challenging. I think that was one of the first games I looked online for help with. Because in the second half of the game, the puzzles get really brutal.
I literally have a childhood memory of like drawing a puzzle room that I was in and taking it to school and asking like all the kids in my class and asking my teacher how to solve this puzzle and like explaining how the puzzle worked to them, and just like spending an entire like real day of my life, not just like my playtime as a child or whatever. But like, yeah, that game got pretty challenging. I guess it's hard to say because I was really young, but replaying that game, those puzzles are still pretty rough.
Yeah, no, I think I was 12 or 13 when I played it, and so I like help websites were around. This would have been like 98, 99-ish. But it was hard to find anything about it, and just a couple dungeons in the latter third of the game really killed me. And they were the ones that were giving you trouble, some of the red block, yellow block ones.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
That's one of the ones that's the one I took to
Yeah,
school.
yeah.
Yeah.
There were two dungeons that had those, and the second of those two had just really challenging puzzles. But Lufia 2, it's the only good game in the Lufia series, which
Yeah.
sounds a little mean to say, but it's absolutely awesome and totally worth playing, even if you don't play any other Lufia games. And honestly, you probably shouldn't play other Lufia games and just go straight to Lufia 2.
Yeah, it's a shame.
It had a DS remake, but I don't know if that was any
It
good or not.
was like a hack and slashy action RPG thing.
What?
I personally didn't like it very much.
Oh, I never
Uh,
played it. It
I've
has good music remixes, but I haven't played
yeah,
it.
I've heard people that like it, but I didn't play all the way through it because it just didn't grab me. Yeah, the last thing I really want to bring up right now is just the games that split Wolf Team, the Tales of Fantasia and Star Ocean 1. Like
Right.
those games were mind blowing for that point in time, and it's hard to acknowledge that in retrospect because we did get them like years after release in the form of fan translations and like eventually in the form of like new ports. But like for those games to be on Super Nintendo, like they made didn't they make a new memory chip?
Um, I don't. I'm not sure. I know they used a late model advanced memory chip for Tales of
Mm,
Fantasia,
yeah.
but I don't. I actually. All right. Well, okay. I have complicated feelings about those two games. I adore Tales of Fantasia. When I was playing emulated SNES games in the early 2000s, that was absolutely one of my favorites. It's really good. Uh, but um. But Star Ocean, I played Star Ocean 1 on the Super Famicom after I had already finished Star Ocean 2 and really liked Star Ocean 2. And I found the combat in Star Ocean 1 really hard to get behind. I never got very far in that game. But I did play the PS1 remake, I'm sorry, PSP remake of Star Ocean 1 several years later, and I did like that one. But yeah, Star Ocean. I think Star Ocean on the Super Famicom's a bit of a hard sell, but the PSP remake's good, and Tales of Fantasia is one of my favorite Super Famicom games. Period. That game's awesome.
Yeah, Tales of Fantasia was definitely a better complete package, but I do think Star Ocean was, and for the most part, has consistently been a more interesting series.
It,
And
and,
like,
and and Star Ocean 1 is ambitious, but as hell. I'm
yeah,
not denying that at all.
the
Yeah.
item creation systems, and like, I know the battle was pretty rough in the SNES version of Star Ocean 1, but like, it is something you can learn to deal with, and like, is the kind of thing you would learn to deal with at the time. And especially when you're dealing with an item creation system that's like just so far beyond your ken at that point in time. Like games, like I guess RoboTrek kind of dove into stuff like that, but that was more about like recipes than just like making dice rolls and trying to discover like your own way to make items. But I just think it's so interesting the way that Wolf Team split over like the development of Tales of Fantasia and like
Yeah,
how you
it's
can
some
see
cool.
like
It's cool behind the scenes drama.
yeah, well, you can see, like, you can clearly see those teams' design philosophies carrying out throughout the course of, like, either whatever the Tales of studio makes and all the weird crap Tri-Ace has made. It, some of which is definitely not crap, and that's great. But, I don't know, like, that's one of the first, like, cool game development stories I also ever heard, like, as a gamer. Like, that split between, Tales of Studio and Trice. Like it's especially when I feel like both turned out so well and like both have like been bigger than the other at different points in time, you know. But
Yeah,
Trice has remained independent.
both of them made amazing RPGs in the 2000s for sure.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was a good time for everybody, I guess.
Yeah. So, I guess I'll talk about a couple of my favorite Super Nintendo RPGs now. The one that, other than Chrono Trigger, the one that stands out the strongest to me is Final Fantasy VI. It was not my first Final Fantasy game. That was 4, but it it was the first. It had the first RPG story and RPG plot points that really blew me away. Its cast of characters is awesome. There's 12 main characters and 2 secret characters that are a really diverse, fun group. And mechanically, it's rock solid just from a navigating menus and and customization standpoint. But each character has a common skill set and a unique skill set, which stands out even today as a really strong setup for a cast of characters in an RPG. I think Final Fantasy VI is one of the best RPGs of all time, one of the signature games for the Super Nintendo, and its soundtrack is I personally think some of Uematsu's best work. So I adore Final Fantasy VI. It's one of my all-time favorites.
Which is funny because I haven't played 6, I'll readily admit that. But that's how I feel about 4. Is like that. I like the arc of the characters. I like the sense of adventure. Like a lot of times, I feel like a lot of RPGs can have they like force in a huge cast of characters, and you end up only caring about 1, 2, or 3 of them. Like it's a very small set, and you always have like your small party that you could pick from 20 people, but I'm gonna stick with this party of 4. In 4, they had characters coming in and out, and each character seemed important. Each character was likable, and each character you ended up caring about. Which I don't feel like that's something I can commonly say about any game. Is that I care about a lot of the characters, and that's something I always felt like with 4 that I genuinely did.
I agree about the emotional attachment in 4, but I also think 6 is like a lot more competent in a lot of ways. Like 4 to me is much more like a quintessential JRPG, and like it set it paved the way for like everything. Like I just feel like it's like it itself is like the Mount Rushmore of what a JRPG is. I don't know what that means.
Wait,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
what does that even mean? Like,
just forget about it. It's okay.
Okay.
I think this is the Mount Rushmore of our conversations.
FF6, beyond everything Mike said that I totally agree with, like, and just like the gravity of that game, beyond even that, like that game kind of became the template of like how to do a JRPG from that point forward. Like so many systems, like subsystems, kind of tried to ape or like kind of just twist the knobs on the Esper system, and and like they'd be lucky if they kept something similar to the unique character skill system. And in that way, like there were just a lot of Me Too's and like a lot of people just like making games. Like FF6 wrote the formula that future JRPGs made their games by. Yeah.
And you want to talk about different types of Final Fantasy systems. FF4 had unique characters that were with mostly unique skill sets, and FF6 had a balance of unique skill sets and shared skill sets. The game in between those, Final Fantasy V, it swings the other way. It's entirely shared skill sets with that job system, and it's a really fun incarnation of the Final Fantasy job system. It's I recently finished playing Bravely Second, and there's a lot of Final Fantasy V DNA in Bravely Second. It's a really fun job system that's awesome to explore. You're consistently getting the new ones through the first half of the game, and the story and characters in FF5 I don't think are as cool as FF4 or FF6, even though it has even though the main villain is one of my favorites. I think Exdeath's a great villain.
Yeah, he is cool as hell.
Yeah, but I don't think the story in FF5 is as good as some of its contemporaries, but the job system is consistently fun to this day. It's a really good execution of that job system.
Yeah, I agree. Like when you told me that you were going to be doing the review for Bravely Default, the first thing I asked you is it as good as FF5? Well, it's a Bravely Default.
Yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm.
All I could ask is it good enough to make me not just want to play FF5 again? Like that game, man. Like even today, I will happily play FF5 like once a year.
This is sort of funny. Even though if I had to rank 4, 5, and 6, I think I would go in reverse time order. 6 is my favorite, then 5, then 4. But 4 is actually the one of those 3 I've played the most because it's out for almost every system. There's like 7 versions of it out, and every time a new version of FF4 comes out, I buy it and replay it, and just haven't
It's
done
so
that, and just haven't done that as much with 5 or 6.
it's so breezy. You can get that through that game in like a couple days, and it just feels nice.
You can, and I have. But yeah, the run of Final Fantasy games on the Super Nintendo was really strong. But I think I mentioned earlier, there's 2 Dragon Quest games and 3 Fire Emblem games on the SNES, and Dragon Quest V is maybe my favorite Dragon Quest game. It's either 5 or 8. And the Fire Emblem games it's harder to find a good translation of those, but I think that Fire Emblem 4, which is Seisen no Keifu, or either Generation of the Holy War or Genealogy of the Holy War, I'm not sure which, is actually a really fascinating design that holds up today. The first half of the game, you fight this nation dividing war, and in the second half, and you can just like in a lot of Fire Emblem games, you can have your characters hook up and get married. And in the second half of the game, you fight like a resurgence of that war, or a resurfacing of the villains from that war as the children from the first generation, the children of the first generation characters, which is a concept that's borrowed in Fire Emblem Awakening and Fire Emblem Fates. But
So that's really interesting to me, because I thought the 3DS games like that. I thought that was a new system that they made.
No, it's not. It's an appropriation of a SNES Fire Emblem game system, and it's a really cool appropriation of it. It's a lot easier to work with than how they did it in Fire Emblem 4. But
That sounds super advanced for the SNES.
yeah, and it's a really good game. The story is a bit of a hard sell. The old writer for the Fire Emblem games, who I think stopped writing them after the SNES era, there's a lot of very uncomfortable situations that happen in that game, especially to women. But it's a good Fire Emblem game from a mechanical standpoint and mostly from a story standpoint. But the one that I played that game with a guide so I could get my characters marrying each other how I wanted them to, and that's actually really important, because in the second half, if you have characters, if you don't have characters get married, then they replace the children with generics, and the generics are terrible. But if you but the children are almost universally really awesome, and like my favorite first generation character has twins in the second generation, and I used her kids for like they were my MVPs of the second half of the game. And I know that if I had crappy generics instead of those two, then I would have crashed and burned hard. Otherwise because I didn't, and I knew to get her married to someone, the second half was easier than the first half. But it's a very good Fire Emblem game with design ideas that hold up, and if you're Fire Emblem curious, then I recommend you check it out. Fire Emblem Seisen
sounds so dirty.
no Keifu.
Oh, a little bit.
If you're Fire Emblem curious.
Oh. Well, all right, sure, but whatever. I'm not saying it's a squeaky clean game either.
Did you have another one, Mike?
Oh sure. There's one that I think all three of us have played. We're all into Super Mario RPG, right?
Yes.
Oh yeah, good call.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the only game with Miyamoto and the Final Fantasy staff in the end credits, and it's a really really good RPG. And it's also an early Yoko Shimomura soundtrack. That's really good. Mm-hmm.
And similar to Luvia too, it gave you something super fun to do in between random encounters.
Yeah, basically incorporating platforming elements into the world map stuff and having all the characters visible on screen, and that so you can initiate or avoid encounters if you wanted to, was a great idea that every Mario RPG has continued with going forward. And it's both as a Mario game and as an RPG, it's really great. And even though I think that game came out in 96, I want to say, maybe 97, people have been whining for 20 years why Mallow and Gino haven't shown up in a new game.
Yeah, that I wonder that myself.
Yeah, Gino had a cameo in one of the Mario and Luigi games, but I think
they made a they made a Geno and Me fighter, if I remember correctly, for the
Oh,
Smash
cool.
4.
Oh,
Um,
awesome. Okay, I didn't know that. That's great.
uh, but, I like how Mario RPG. I guess this is like totally of my generation problem, but like that game's like wholly understandable for a child. Like the numbers are so small and digestible, and like the math makes sense, and like you can see directly how like defense and offense are proportional to those numbers. Like it's not inflated numbers like Final Fantasy usually does, just for the sake of having big numbers, which is cool. I like it, but like as a literal Babby's first RPG, like Super Mario RPG is like it's so pure and good and just nice. And like I guess the timed hit system isn't not fun. Like it's consistently cool throughout the game. So
Yeah,
lots of
and
fun
yeah,
secrets as
it's
well.
great.
Yeah. Did you play the early Shin Megami Tensei games, like 1 and 2?
I did not. I did play a partially translated version of SMT If,
Okay.
which is weird and different, and sometimes called Persona Zero for how similar it is to Persona One to Persona One. But I didn't get very far in that one either. So yeah, go ahead and tell us about the some of the Atlas stuff.
So they are like super dungeon crawly and grindy. Like the battles are kind of quick, but it doesn't really save it from that. Like it's just amazing to me in retrospect, or like playing it when I did, which was like late into my adult life. Like the demon fusion system is like mostly what you expect it to be. Like it has not changed much, like since the very first games, and like it's just really amazing to me. Like I can't imagine having access to that when I was that age. I feel like I would have endlessly fiddled with fusing demons together and like altering my alignment and stuff. Like which it does have a fairly decent chaotic neutral lawful alignment system. The first two ones do. Um, but yeah, the demon fusion's just like I think that's the really notable thing about those first two games, and I guess the story is like really weird and dark and occult, which is fun. I like that stuff.
Right, right. Now a lot of people like Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne, obviously.
Oh
So
yeah,
do you think someone that likes Nocturne would be comfortable going back and seeking out of some playable version of SMT 1 or 2, and would they be comfortable in it, or would it be a little too dated, you think, for someone that was into Nocturne? Because I get really leery about old RPGs that are sometimes just way too grindy and way too, you know, because I don't have as much time as I did when I was younger.
sure, yeah.
But so do you think that are they either time wise or mechanics wise a little dated, or do you think they hold up? Because I don't know anything about SMT 1 or 2.
My experience was that don't expect like super tight, challenging battles like SMT3 has. Um, for me, it was just kind of like long periods of dungeon crawling, really a plot I was really into, and I was okay with dungeon crawling in between plot segments. And then just having fun with Doom Infusion. If that sounds good to you, and you're prepared for the dungeon crawling, and you're prepared for like a little bit of too many random encounters, and like way too much auto battling, just like brace yourself for that. But if you're feeling a dark, cool SMT story, they're definitely worth revisiting, I would say.
Okay. Hmm. Yeah, I would think about playing those, but I don't know. There's too many games I want to play that I've already been planning to anyway. It's
See, I've always wanted
Yeah.
to get to any of the SMT games because I've only played Persona games.
Ooh, boy. SMT3 might be my favorite video game.
And I always get caught up
strong
in
word.
almost exactly what Mike's saying is there's so much other things that's going on that it's hard to go back and there's such a wide berth of like games that you could go back to, so it kind of makes it difficult to be like, well, I'm gonna pick this one. And then
Right.
not to toot our own horn, that's one of the great things about Retro Encounter.
Huh.
But it gives you like that motivation and a reason to have to go back and play one of them.
Right, you
Uh,
get the paralysis of too much choice, right? Like
Absolutely.
I could play anything right now. Well, I don't know which one.
And to
Yes.
bring it back to the Super Nintendo, I mean that's one of those things like I I missed a generation of gaming for that in a lot of regards. And so then you look at it and it's like there's hundreds of games and there's tens and tens of games that are just superb. You know,
Yep.
one of the things that we have not talked about Zelda on this podcast. Um,
We've talked about talking about Zelda, but he's
Yes.
never actually talked about Zelda.
But it's one of those things like you start thinking about it, like we have a dozen games that we've named that all of them are superb. There's at least another dozen or 2 dozen of games that like I know people are listening to this right now and screaming, "Why aren't you talking about this? Because this game is fantastic."
Right.
And like bring it back to SMT. I was like, there's just so much there. There's a lot to go back to, and then the terrible or wonderful, like it's double-edged sword with this. RPGs are typically very long games.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like, hey, you know what? I'm gonna sit down for an afternoon. I'm gonna tear through this, and I'm gonna move on to my next one and just check this off the list. This is a week. This is a 2 week. This is a month time that you have to dedicate to be able to beat these.
And you briefly mentioned Zelda. We would be remiss not to mention that the Super Nintendo has A Link to the Past, which is one of the best Zelda games.
Yeah.
It's in my top 3 favorites.
It set up the blueprint for everything else.
Yeah.
It did.
I'd make the argument. So I mean, it's one of those things. It always gets difficult with quality when you have something that made basically the genre of games. But at the very least, it is massively important. And if that type of game is something that you care about, you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't experience it. We can ignore Zelda like we usually do on this podcast because
Sure. Well, I don't know how much longer we'll be ignoring Zelda, but now, Josh, you've mentioned on several times in this podcast that you're not hugely you didn't play a ton of Super Nintendo RPGs or even Super Nintendo games in general. So I think I would like to take this opportunity, and Davey, please, you and I both should take this opportunity to try and convince you to play a couple Super Nintendo classics. Would you be interested in that, Josh?
So are we basically, you guys are going to give your sales pitch, and then I give a thumbs up, thumbs down?
Sure. Yeah, sounds great.
All right, let's go. Game 1. Boom.
Okay, Davey, you want to go first or shall I?
I think you should go first.
Okay, all right. Now I'm gonna bring up a game that is a hugely popular, well-known Super Nintendo game that we have not mentioned on this podcast yet, and probably some people listening are probably upset I haven't mentioned it yet. Earthbound is an excellent Super Nintendo RPG that feels unlike any other RPG I've ever played. It's set in a really weird, cartoony version of the real world that quickly goes into sort of absurdist regions. You end up rescuing one of your party members from a cult that's obsessed with the color blue, even though they all wear purple. There's a zombie attack that coincides with a UFO attack, and you have to defeat a giant puddle of barf to stop the zombies. And
Yo.
it has this weird cartoony visual that almost looks like I don't think this is my analogy, but some writer said it's like the Cthulhu mythos or like a space horror show infiltrated the Charlie Brown and Snoopy show, since it's all this very colorful rounded edges look that goes into some twisted, insane places. And it's also one of the funniest scripts I've ever read. Like it is so funny and weird that people have been telling Earthbound jokes for decades on the internet.
There's a magical talking dog named Rafiki. It's possessed by the spirit of the game developers to teach you how to use an ATM.
Yep. Oh, and one of the status effects that you get is homesickness, where Ness, the main character, will just sit and pout during battle if he hasn't called home in a while. So you have to call mom to cure yourself of homesickness. And your dad is around. Like your house is only you, your mom, and I think your dog. But and your dad is always working, and you never get to see him. But he sends you money that you can pick up at an ATM, and whenever you call him, and you call your dad to save. But it does so many strange things. Like you can call a pizza delivery service and have them deliver you a pizza no matter where you are, whether you're in a cave or in a town or anything. But when I think you start going into like imaginary realms and like other dimensions, they can't deliver pizzas to you there. Uh, it's like it's a completely crazy RPG that is that has a lot of heart and goes to some really strange places. And I think that anyone that's interested in RPGs of this era needs to play Earthbound.
All right,
It's
so
it's a trip.
first of all, that's just cheating. You can't pick Earthbound.
Why not? Have you played Earthbound?
No, but I desperately want to. So you get a thumbs up because I already want to play it, but instead of like for the official thumbs up, thumbs down for who wins overall with better recommendations,
I didn't know. I didn't know this was a competition.
Oh, everything's a competition with me. We're gonna have to kind of spin it differently, so I'll rate you on whether or not you did a good job explaining it, and I'll overall give you a thumbs up because you mentioned pizza and zombies and homesickness. So
All three of those things are well represented in Earthbound.
thumbs up on Earthbound. All right, Davey, do you want to cheat and just pick a? Are you gonna bring up Zelda again? Like,
I'm not gonna do that. No. So I know that you have been known to enjoy a good strategy RPG, and I thought I would pitch to you a game by the name of Bahamut Lagoon, in which imagine in a strategy RPG, if your unit that you moved around tile by tile was actually a small party, like imagine like a party from a Final Fantasy game, and when you attack someone, you play out a couple turns in a real-time battle or like an active time battle, like you would in Final Fantasy, and that's your basic attack. Does that interest you? Are you on the hook right now?
No. Tell him how those parties move around, Davey.
You move around like a tactics RPG. But in addition to those parties, you also have dragon units that you raise by feeding items, and it increases their stats and teaches them new skills. And their skills are kind of like it's like having like a godlike unit on the battlefield that flies around and can shoot spells like a mage would in FF Tactics, if you can imagine that. So they're kind of like your mage units, while everyone else like has like infantry on infantry combat.
I'm gonna give it like a slight thumbs up.
Come on, man, that's an awesome thing. It's kind of a lot like what Devil Survivor does, if you've ever played that.
Nope.
Well, okay, I can vouch for Bahamut Lagoon. I never finished it, but I did get pretty far before getting stuck. It's a very good strategy RPG from that era, and like feeding your dragons to make them stronger and designing parties to be, balanced or super offensive or super defensive is really, really fun. And also, I think is your base is an airship, right?
Hell yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and in between fights, you can go around and talk to everyone on your airship and see all the ridiculous relationship stuff that's going on. Like you have two lancers on your team that are always playing pranks on each other, and there's one dude that has like a different crush on a different one of your female characters every time. It has a lot of character, and it is a fun strategy RPG that stands on its own as a game. It's a good one.
I'm intrigued by the dragons.
The dragons are pretty awesome.
The dragons are great.
I'll give you a half a thumbs up, which rounds up to a full thumbs up.
Think about it. You feel so cool when you shoot a spell at a ground unit, and then it hits that entire party, and like all the party members lose HP, and you're like, haha, sucker. You move everyone else in to take them out. Man, it's a lot of fun. It's also not that long. I should have said that.
Oh, I see.
It's like 25 hours long.
Gotten a full thumbs up then.
Yeah, it's like 25 hours long. It's not that bad.
All right, Mike. Game 2.
Okay. Well, this is like game 2A and 2B because it's really just a 2-game series. No, all right. I was gonna talk about Tactics Ogre and Ogre Battle, but instead I'll just talk about Tactics Ogre. Okay?
Yeah.
I'll do a correction.
See, you're already cheating though because you've talked to me enough in your naming games that I want to play.
All right. Okay. Well, which one should I talk about then? Well, all right.
Tactics Ogre.
Yeah, absolutely. Tactics Ogre.
Tactics Ogre is made by the Quest team that was eventually sort of absorbed into Square. So and that team went on to make Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy 12, among a couple other things, I think. But anyway, Tactics Ogre is very similar to Final Fantasy Tactics. Sometimes it's even called Final Fantasy Tactics 0. and in that it has sort of that isometric view with elevation based squares instead of a flat grid of squares like an old Fire Emblem game or like Bahamut Lagoon. But it's basically it employs a system where you move characters around and have them strategically, attack and perform skills just like FF Tactics. But what's really interesting about it is that there are branching story pathways, and you can influence your character's attitude and even stats by having its fortune read at the beginning of the game. And the classes themselves go to some pretty crazy lengths. Like yeah. Like I mean, I still like the starting archer class is so good that I use them through the whole game. But by the end of the game, you're getting into some crazy angels and demons stuff that is not adequate, that I can't adequately explain here. But it's a really fun class system, really fun branching storyline system, and the story I've only played through part of the PS1 port of the SNES game, and what I really want to do is go through the PSP version that was released I think 5 or 6 years ago, because that one looks like the version that is the best one to play. But it's
very different.
It is? Really?
Yeah. Well, in terms of mechanics in the job system, it's very different.
Okay.
Also very, very cool in the way that it's different. I still think the original is cool to consider on its own, though.
Yeah, and Ogre Battle, even though it's ostensibly in the same series as Tactics Ogre, is so different because it has a party organization system, kind of like Bahamut Lagoon, but it's in real time, and yet it's almost like playing a real time strategy game, sending units around and seeing them encounter enemy parties. They're both really different and really good, but I think Tactics Ogre is the one that feels a little bit more modern and easier to get into.
You forgot to mention that basic soldiers can throw stone.
That's true.
They can throw stones. I'm sure you're used to that. Man, I had another selling point on Tactics Ogre, and now it's slipping me. I feel so bad.
It's a really good game.
Yeah, Tactics Ogre is going to be a game that we for sure cover in this podcast. That there's enough, just like everybody seems to love that game, and then Tactics went so well with the podcast. I would be dumbfounded if we never make our way at some point to Tactics Ogre.
Robert Steinman, who is the host of Random Encounter, RPG Fans flagship podcast.
Is it flagship really?
Well, it's the one it's the only one with over 100 episodes.
Okay, that's fair.
He played Tactics Ogre for the first time either last year or the year before. I'm not sure exactly when. And he liked it so much that he still bugs me about playing it whenever strategy RPGs, the subject of strategy RPGs seems to comes up. He gets really excited talking about Tactics Ogre. It's by all accounts, a really, really good strategy RPG.
I can't remember if they kept it in the PSP version, but in Tactics Ogre, when you're on a city, you can decide to have a scrimmage against your own army. You can split it up. Instead of using an army of 10, you can do 5 and 5, or you can have backup units to throw on, and you can fight each other for XP. But you can also do it 2-player, so you can have a little competitive match. And when I played Tactics Ogre, me and my wife each took control of raising 5 characters and would play through the game when we were home and free or whatever. And every time our times overlapped, we'd fight each other's armies, and it was really cool.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's just a fun story. Sorry.
All right, thumbs up. Davey, game 2. You better get this or else you're gonna lose.
All right.
Fight for the tie here.
So, I'm going to talk to you about a game called Front Mission Gun Hazard. It's kind of like an early Metroidvania game, in that you're gaining levels, you're leveling up the parts you're using on your robot, and you're moving around in an action RPG kind of thing. And it is a side-scrolling RPG, much in the way you would expect a Metroidvania to be, but you have instead of a double jump, you have 6 vernier thrusters that you can upgrade and use better ones as you level up. And you also get robot punch hand, robot shotgun, robot rocket. You can you get a dash unit too, so you can use it. So in the the coolest thing about Front Mission Gun Hazard is you start off like just like a little machine gun, no dash unit, no cool booster jets, and by the end of the game, you're like literally playing almost entire stages using the jump button to thrust your verniers and like have epic dogfights in the skies against other robots, and like you'll even fight bosses up there like on top of like giant battleships that are flying through the sky. It's epic and awesome and fast paced and like way easier to go back to than most SNES RPGs, just because the action is so frenetic and like the basic leveling up system is so good.
Nice, thumbs up. All right, so we have a
Yeah.
tie. I could be cheap on this, or I thought of, since I don't think you guys have an additional game that each of you thought of, did you?
Now, well, in the interest of time, we each picked two.
Okay. Well, for a tiebreaker, you guys have 5 seconds to name a game really quickly. 1, 2, 3, 4,
Dragon Quest 6.
5.
Secret of Mana 2. Wow.
Well, we both suck. I don't like either of those games, so you guys both
I'm-
lose.
Oh man, how do you
What?
not like Second Densetsu?
I don't know.
Second and Densetsu 3 rules, dude.
Yeah.
No,
I'm voting for Davey just because he picked a better game than
I
I
was
did.
gonna say Davey overall. Before even the tiebreaker, Davey did a better job of not picking games that everybody would pick. So, Davey wins.
I'm just such a basic bitch that I lose.
You picked Earthbound.
You
Yeah.
haven't played Earthbound, and we hadn't
I-
talked about it yet.
If I really wanted to win, I would have laid into how crappy Earthbound is to actually play through. Like, the encounters in that game are really, really not fun.
But they ask
I
what your
thi-
favorite food is.
It gets a lot better once you get 3 characters on your team. It's really rough in the first hour or two when it's only Ness, and then for a while only Ness and Paula. But it gets better. Like, the flow and pace of the game get better in the second half. Now, you want to talk about a game with terrible pacing and encounters. Mother 1 is
Oh, yeah.
is a pile of garbage. It does cool story stuff. It does cool story stuff, but it is so miserable to play through that I wholeheartedly recommend reading a Wikipedia article about Mother 1 and not playing it.
So, I want to bring up, I just noticed a theme in all these games we just pitched to Josh.
All of
Like,
them are from Square.
No,
Uh,
Earthbound isn't.
Almost all of them are from Square.
yeah, almost all of them were. Crap.
Sure, yeah.
None of them have traditional random encounters, like the way you would expect a JRPG of that era to.
It's almost like the random encounter isn't as good as, I don't know, retro encounter.
Wow.
Wow. Serious shade. But
Josh, you could start like a rap feud. You got to be careful, man.
well, no comment on on Josh's assertion there, but Davey, I think you're onto something. Like, the old system of random encounters feels like a dated, busted system in 2016. It's annoying having exploration interrupted at random times with combat, even when combat is fun or good or necessary.
Yeah.
So I think that the best, RPGs nowadays would never use a random encounter system unless it had a twist, like when Bravely Default lets you turn random encounters either on or off or at double rate.
Or like Undertale.
or like Undertale, where they're
Spoilers.
where I don't know, like
There's lots of stuff
Undertale,
behind
yeah.
encounters. Yeah.
Yeah, Undertale subverts the idea of random encounters in a fascinating way that we won't get into. But yeah, for a modern RPG, having a regular ass random encounter system wouldn't work. And so some of the RPGs from the SNES era that stand out as special to us are the ones that don't use random encounters, except FF6, which is great.
They future-proofed
Well-
themselves, almost. In a way, and it's something they probably didn't even realize that they were testing out the boundaries and testing out different things. But in a lot of ways, by having that, they future-proofed themselves so they could be
Yeah,
experienced and enjoyed later on.
And I should mention, FF6 does have an item that lets you turn off random encounters in the later part of the game, which is great.
More than that, FF6 has like kind of a peanut butter to the chocolate in the form of the
What is the
Esper
deal
system.
with you and peanut butter? Somebody get that kid a Reese's.
Because that's a I do like
Hey.
a Reese's.
Reese's Cups are freaking delicious.
All right. But like in the way that in between random encounters, like you want to jump into that menu and like check your espers and like see how you're leveling up and like you have something to do. And like it was how we were talking about with Super Mario RPG and with Lufia and like games like that, they would put something in between the random encounters to entice you, so that you wouldn't mind as much like going to a random encounter because you just got a cool, fun break from them. Whereas like a lot of the other games we brought up today just had like totally different systems, like Front Mission Gun Hazard, Tales of Fantasia, Star Ocean. Like the encounter.
Tales of Fantasia does have random encounters,
No.
and they get really annoying sometimes.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is like what made those games memorable is like the battle systems were just so different and like they stood out in that way.
I love combat in Tales of Fantasia so much. It's great.
Like at some point, I kind of feel like after FF4, people were like, "Man, these guys did it. Let's do something different."
Yeah.
Is that just me? Oh, I guess Dragon Quest is examples.
Dragon Quest
The
did the same
opposite.
thing forever.
Yeah.
No, we're not having a Dragon Quest argument today.
You're right. You're right. I'm not gonna argue about it today, but I still like Dragon Quest.
I'm not trying to diss Dragon Quest. I think they've perfected a system and they've done a very good job with it. And in a lot of ways now, since it is old, it's new again because we've moved so far away from it, and it is refreshing.
Yeah.
But Dragon Quest is a topic for another day.
Sure. Yeah. I will. If we ever sign up to talk about a Dragon Quest game, I will probably try to get on that podcast because I love Dragon Quest. And Dragon Quest 5 and 6 on the Super Famicom are excellent, and it's worth picking up the DS versions of those two games.
But don't get 4 because it's bad.
No, 4 is good too. I think
terrible.
I think 4 is probably. I like 4 more than 6 actually, but 5 is the real winner of those three.
I was about to say, can you like? Do you really think I would enjoy playing that game? Like knowing me, and I'm asking this seriously.
Don't play.
Like I played the only Dragon Quest I played was 7, and like I gave up about 15, maybe 20 hours in. Like it was not pushing any buttons for me.
7 is the actual numbered 1 through 9. I've beaten every Final Fantasy. I'm sorry.
Wow.
Let me slow down.
If it was the 90s, you could
Freudian
get killed for
slip.
that, man.
Okay. Well, 1 through 9, I have beaten every Final Fantasy game as well. But 1 through 9, I've beaten every Dragon Quest game except for 7, because 7 is the PS1 version of 7 is so slow moving and boring that I could not finish it. But I have resolved to get the 3DS version when it comes out and try and give it another shot.
Really beat Final Fantasy 2?
Yeah, I did. I beat the GBA version of it.
Word, is it different?
Not different enough. It's still the worst Final Fantasy game.
All right.
Yeah. I don't have many nice things to say about FF2 for the NES/GBA. But anyway, Dragon Quest V, I think, represents one of the best hero's journeys in video game history. It's a little bit slow moving at first, but you play as the main character from a point when he's a very small child, then as a teenager, and then as a married man, because you meet, depending on which version you play, you meet either 2 or 3 women, and you get to marry one of them.
Yeah, which is fascinating. 5 is really
cool.
interesting.
Yeah, and then later you get to play as your final party basically is you, your wife, and your 2 children.
Yeah,
and
super cool.
Yeah, and like the whole hero's journey of the main character and what he goes through, avoiding spoilers, even though the game is from like 1994 or something. Is really awesome. It's my favorite main character of any Dragon Quest game, and admittedly the combat is a little rote. It uses a very early one of the first games where you get to recruit monsters into your party.
Okay.
And because you only get, I think, maybe 4 or 5 human characters total.
Totally, we talked about Lufia too. Didn't even mention the capsule monsters.
Oh shoot! Yeah, there's in Lufia 2, there's 8 capsule monsters that you can recruit and feed them items to make them grow stronger. The first one's named Fumi, which is just hilarious. And well, yeah, Lufia 2 is great. We should just do Lufia 2 on this podcast.
It's so much. Except the bummer about Lufia 2 is that it does have that Suikoden thing going on where the translation screwed up some boss fights.
And I'm
whatever.
confident
Dragon Quest V is good.
I'm confident that we have forgotten lots of games that people would like to talk about. So please go onto the boards, rpgfan.com, and tell us what we forgot.
Oh, can you give me 30 minutes to talk about Seventh Saga first?
Nope.
And Breath of Fire 2?
Nope.
Wait, are you being serious?
I'm willing to give you 30 seconds.
No.
I didn't bring up Brandish, and it hurts my soul a little bit. I'll just say, go play Brandish. Everybody, right now, go play Brandish. It's fun.
No. Finish the podcast
It's
first.
just fun. Well,
Oh
okay.
no. Before you play Brandish, go and play ActRaiser, made by Enix, early '90s. It's like half adventure platformer, half strategy shooter, half RPG.
God game.
ActRaiser's great.
Man, there's a lot of weird stuff. We should like make a guide or something to weird good stuff.
We
RPGs.
we did an episode about Terra Nigma, and we haven't talked about that at all yet.
Yeah, well, I feel like we covered Terra Nigma.
Okay.
Yeah, we still like 3 podcasts
There's
on Terra
3
Nigma.
episodes about Terra Nigma. I actually learned a lot about Terra Nigma in those podcasts. That was a good experience.
Hey.
Brainlord was a super weird game. Arcana, Dungeon Master, which became...
Arcana is terrible. I hated that game.
But the music was cool, and I'd never played a first-person dungeon crawler before, so I thought that was novel.
Well, I rented Arcana for 2 weeks when I was 10, and I hated it.
It's hard. Yeah.
Well, maybe if you didn't suck at games, you'd have enjoyed it.
Maybe.
It definitely has a character named Tifa in it, like 5 years before FF7.
I had to say what the internet was thinking.
Super weird. Lots of people like Breath of Fire 1 and 2 for some reason.
I do like Breath of Fire 2. Breath of Fire 2 is the only Breath of Fire game I finished.
It's alright.
It's okay. It's not as good as it's not as good as the RPGs we've been talking about in greater detail.
Agreed. I'm sorry. There's a lot of these games. I just like as soon as I look at this list, I want to play like 3 of these at any given point.
You want to talk about a weird one? Secret of Evermore is a game that was made by the SquareSoft staff in the United States that normally publish Square's games.
So weird and interesting. And cool.
It's the American SquareSoft game.
Yeah. So Davey just touched on this, but the dirty secret about this podcast is Davey made up a list of, I don't know, like 100 games. And the original idea was like, hey, let's talk about every game. Like, let's do each game like a couple minutes. I'm like, no, we're not doing a 5-hour podcast.
God, we probably are already around 2 hours, aren't we?
We're only at 1 hour and 10.
Oh, okay, that's not so bad.
Yeah, no, that doesn't mean I'm going to give you another half an hour, but...
No, you're going to give us another 3 hours and 50 minutes so we get up to 5, right?
Oh, yeah. No, we have a podcast that we're recording this month that will probably be a 2 to 3 hour podcast. This is not that one. But yeah, we would love to hear everybody's opinions out there. I'm confident that we forgot some of your favorites. We'd love to hear you. First of all, what you enjoyed, why, and we'd love to hear your opinions. As always, you guys can jump on the boards, like I mentioned earlier. You can talk to us on Twitter. You can jump onto iTunes and give us those wonderful reviews. I know we are also currently in the process of getting on Google Play, so that should be happening relatively soon. Hopefully by the time you guys hear this, we are available there. But if you're already listening to us, you probably already have a way of listening to us, so it doesn't matter, but whatever. It's there.
Wait, so if people can reach out to us on Twitter, how do they do that, Josh?
They can look up my name and find me. No.
Wow.
I'm on Twitter at JD Curry, JDCURRY.
And I'm also on Twitter at The Real Monsoon.
And
Not the fake one.
No. The fake Monsoon is unverified. You want at The Real Monsoon.
I am at Davi_Kaze, DAVIKAZE.
See, really?
What?
No,
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead. Never mind. I'm confused myself.
It's the Japanese word for wind, right?
Yes, it is.
I wasn't listening well enough, and I spelled it differently in my head from what I heard. Or yeah, yep. And that's gonna do it for us. Like I said, just reach out to us somehow. We'd love to hear what your favorite games are. In the meantime, during the month of May, we are playing Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. As I've said, I feel like I've said that a lot of times. So hopefully you guys have heard it at some point. Everybody get excited because you finally get to listen to me have to talk about Zelda. So at the very least, that will be entertaining.
Yeah, I have not played Majora's Mask, so I'm really interested to see what everyone thinks about it on the podcast.
The first minute of it's really pretty. Looks good on that 3DS.
Cool. You've only played 1 minute and then you couldn't handle it anymore?
Yeah, I made it to... I had to control Link, and I was like, no, done with this. So, yeah, that'll be a fun month. So get excited, everyone. But in the meantime, that is going to do it for us here at Retro Encounter. Thank you for listening to what is arguably the best podcast in RPG fan.
Let's not have that argument.
Yeah, let's not. So, but Lufia 2 was like Wild Arms before Wild Arms. It had all the systems that you'd expect from like a level 5 game on the PS2. Like, man, I tried to tell you, it's important.
Davey, you have to have a pause so that it's easier for Mike to edit.
I'm sure I'll manage just fine, guys.